It is, for me, not only a pleasure but a privilege to be asked to introduce Tris Engelhardt this morning. Many of you know a great deal about Dr. Engelhardt, because generally in many audiences say, you don't need an introduction. He doesn't need an introduction. You don't need an introduction to him. Some of you are here for the first time, and you should know before whom you sit. So let me tell you some things about Dr. Engelhardt. I can't tell you as much as I should because the time is limited here this morning.
And there's much you could say which you shouldn't mention.
I will not tell you that he is an apostate as opposed to a heretic. You'll have to find that out from someone else. But anyway, Dr. Engelhardt holds an MD with honors from Tulane University Medical School and a BA and a PhD, PhD, that is a doctorate in philosophy, from the University of Texas at Austin. He has received many honorary doctorates from European universities and from Romania and other places. He's been a visiting scholar in many places in Europe and in the United States. He has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in West Berlin and a visiting scholar at the Liberty Fund here in the United States. Currently, he is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at Rice University and professor emeritus in the Department of Medicine, the Department of Community Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. He has held appointments at Rice and Baylor since January 1983. It's probably before some of you in this room were born. Leaving Georgetown University, where he once held the Rosemary Kennedy Professorship in Philosophy of Medicine. Dr. Engelhardt is the senior editor. Now, his list of publications is just amazing. He is the senior editor of the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy, of the Journal of Christian Bioethics, of the Journal of Philosophy and Medicine book series with over 110 volumes in print, and of the book series Philosophical Studies in Contemporary Culture. He has authored over 360 articles. I've written opposing articles to some of them.
But not enough.
And chapters of books in addition to the over 120 book reviews and other publications. His work ranges from continental philosophy and the history of medicine to the philosophy of medicine and bioethics. There have been more than 140 reprintings or translations of his publications. He has also edited over 30 volumes and has lectured widely throughout the world. His books include Bioethics and Secular Humanism, Search for a Common Morality, the second thoroughly revised edition of The Foundations of Bioethics, which has been translated into Chinese, Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, and Texan.
Translated from the Texan, madam, in English.
A Chinese translation of Bioethics and Secular Humanism appeared in 1998. His most recent work is The Foundation of Christian Bioethics, which has appeared in Greek, Portuguese, and Romanian. His most recent and edited volumes include Global Bioethics, The Collapse of Consensus, The Philosophy of Medicine Reborn, and Innovation in the Pharmaceutical Industry. Today, he will speak to us from his more continental tradition, after metaphysics, and Hegel seriously. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Engelhardt.
Thank you very much. Sweet time.
Oh, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and pleasure to be here today. Let me begin by doing something that physicians do, to give free and informed consent. Orthodox Christians know that it's not only permitted, but in some circumstances obligatory to lie. And what do you...
Excuse me, the microphone needs to be turned.
Well, I'm...
Couldn't be heard. You couldn't be heard in the back.
I bet you can hear me without the microphone. Are you having any problem there? Okay. You're welcome, sir, I think. I want to make sure that you understand the reason I mentioned Hegel is that I see Hegel as the end of the scholastic project in the West. That there's a real sense that what began in 1210 after the translation of Aristotle into Latin in Paris finally has culmination with Hegel, who sees it simply won't work. Hence the phrase, after metaphysics, taking Hegel seriously. The goal is to focus on the issue of our secular culture. This focus will, I hope, help us better, and in the discussion after the paper, better, to understand both the secularity of our age and its roots. For those who go to sleep in the middle of the lecture, and I will not read the whole lecture, being a man educated by pedants, I will only read 3 of the 5 sections. The rest, I'm sure, will be published in some obscure place. First, I will talk about the development of our secular culture. And in some of the points are made in the sections I do not read, and it points out what has happened is the deflation of traditional Western Christian morality. If one reads Immanuel Kant, he pulls out every last bit of moral commitments he learned from his pietist mother out of the categorical imperative. I mean, it is remarkable. He sees in there everything he wanted ever to have a purely secular argument to sustain. So there was, up until an attempt to bring out of a kind of natural law argument everything that Western Christians wanted to believe in. After the Enlightenment fully has its impact on the West, people lose sight of that and now have new idols, such as liberty, equality, social justice, human dignity, concept totally unknown to Christians beforehand, which are meant to give the general framework of this now deflated morality. So, for example, once one's passed beyond the collapse of traditional Christian morality, people decide whether they will be homosexual, heterosexual, or shoe fetishist, depending on whether they're treating all others as equal, recognizing their human dignity, and doing whatever they do with expensive shoes and shoe fetishism with a recognition of social justice. So those become the constraints. Now, what is happening now is everyone is coming closer, Pace Lorado Rawls and Richard Rorty, to realize there's no argument for equality, liberty, social justice, and human dignity. Do you ever talk to famous philosophers? One of the peculiarities is they walk back and forth having intuitions. So when they have one intuition, all you have to do is have a different intuition and ask, where's the next higher intuition to mediate amongst the two? And so one ends up with different clusters of intuitions supported by moral narratives, all secured by no sound rational argument. Because to have a sound rational argument work, you have to share the same basic premises and the same views of moral evidence. And we don't have that. I mean, everyone should realize we have no common morality. People disagree about when it is obligatory, forbidden, or licit to have sex, reproduce, transfer property, or kill someone. I teach Kant. I'm teaching Kant now. About 4 years ago, I had a very good student who was also a lawyer. And to let people know that we don't share one morality together, I asked her, and I won't mention her name because she's a lawyer and you're now recording me, what would she be doing? What would she do? She was sitting in the back of her apartment on the patio owned by her. She saw a man crawling over the back fence. I asked her to think that she was reading Kant's Zum ewigen Frieden, to perpetual peace for the course, and that the sun is already set. That is, the sun is not visible, but the nice golden rays of the evening are there. I asked, what would you do? She said, well, Professor Engelhardt, I would, because I have to prepare for the course the next day, continue reading with one hand, and look at him on the other, and when he got both feet and down and his hands off the wall, I'd pull out my .357 Magnum and kill him. Then I'd read to the end of the section, mark it, and call the sheriff and say, I have some garbage in my backyard, will you please remove it? Now, anyone who is a good Texan or has read the Bible knows the Bible distinguishes killing people at night, for which there's no fault, and those where there is the sun shining, and that's why we Texans, not being fully secularized, still have this distinction that guides us. Some of you may have perverse moral views and wouldn't shoot the person. If you see my view in all ways in way misguided, you understand we don't share a common morality. We don't have one. We disagree about when it's good, right, or virtuous to kill people, not kill people, or just decide it's a neutral issue. So the first part is this background recognition that we're separated by moral views in a secular culture that's lost the arguments to sustain its sacred phrases like equality, liberty, social justice, and dignity. The speaker last night mentioned it, saying that, you know, because we're created, we're equal. Well, toads are created, roaches are created, the seraphim and the cherubim are created. I like to ask you, if you ever find two equal people, Dr. Bishop, Dr. Nash and I would like to examine them. I've never met them. Okay, but the argument's all collapsing. So that's in the background. Then the second part of the argument is why the collapse. And I will argue that there have been at least 5 prominent forces in the collapse of Christian culture and its replacement by the now dominant secular culture. What I mean by the dominant secular culture is not the culture you find if you go to a honky-tonk in Texas with right-believing good old boys or good old girls, but that which is in fact the content of law and enforceable public policy. That's the dominant secular culture. And maybe 90% of people disagree with it. In that it has the force of law, it is the dominant one. Professor Hogan didn't point out, in my youth I was a deputy sheriff, and I understand what it is to enforce the dominant morality. So I'll say there are 5 things that happen. First, the collapse of Christendom. Like Christendom that was given to us by St. Constantine the Great, equal to the apostles. Second, the remarkable disarray of mainline Christianity. So third, the collapse of belief in metaphysics, natural law. It's hard going through at least parts of the United States, and I just got back this Monday from Germany to find hardly anyone who takes metaphysics, much less natural law, seriously. And that how the dominant culture now lives fully within the horizon of the finite and the immanent, asking us, inviting us to act as if God did not exist, and so that everything is coming from nowhere, going to nowhere, and for no ultimate purpose. And that leading in the end to creating a fully secular culture. So that's the outline. At the end, I'm going to make a suggestion what we can do about it. We Texans are not Pacific people, and we would like to take after the enemy. And so the last section is about that issue. Now I'll begin to read my boring paper. Gird your loins. Ours is a new age. There has never been any time like it before. It is an age after God. In its law and public policy, it is even after the superstitions nurtured in vague New Age spiritualities that distantly recall the Roman Empire in its paleo-paganism. After a modernity that attempted to preserve Christian morality without Christ, a fully post-Christian, indeed secular age after God has dawned. It is incarnate in contemporary law and public policy. It sustains a secular post-Christian culture. We are in new cultural territory. This point deserves underscoring. A profound rupture from the Christian past has occurred. The dominant secular culture of the West, as one finds it in contemporary law and public policy, which is the dominant culture of the world, is not just disconnecting from its Christian past, it is aggressively setting this past behind it as it had been an evil temptation. This profound disconnection from Christianity has severed the dominant contemporary secular culture of the official culture of law and public policy from the culture that framed Europe for a millennium and a half. The result is the emergence of a genre of secularity with laicist passions that is a cultural novum, a laicism, now salient, that seeks to render Christianity in particular, and other religions in general, but most especially fundamentalist, monotheistic religion, into a past that is not even to be recognized as an element of the past of this new secular culture. There are some who attempt to discount the dramatic character of this change. Gianni Vattimo, the contemporary Italian philosopher who has the horrible problem of being 2 years older than I am, correctly notes that the contemporary secular culture grew out of Western Christianity. Contemporary secularism is the outgrowth of the Christianity that in Paris in 1210 passionately embraced the works of Aristotle published that year in Latin. This fateful fusion of pagan Greek philosophy and Christianity created a faith in reason as strong as the prior traditional Christianity's faith in God. This faith in reason made it possible for Western Christianity to have a driving faith in secular reason. From this faith in reason and moral philosophy, modern secularity eventually emerged along with the secular fundamentalist state. In the ordo essendi, contemporary secularism is independent of Christianity. This is the case because this secularity is different in kind from the culture of traditional Christianity. Its cardinal moral terms have a different intention, have a different meaning, and a different extension, point out different things, than those that exist in traditional Christianity, because the understandings of the right, the good, and the virtuous are framed as if all came from nowhere, were going nowhere, and for no ultimate purpose. In contrast, traditional Christianity appreciates that the good, the right, and the virtuous are can only be understood in terms of the holy, conveys ultimate meaning to everything. In traditional Christianity, the ultimate root of the holy who conveys this meaning is God himself. Moreover, this secularity is committed to being essentially different from Christian culture. One might think of the passion with which secularists rejected even a mention in the European Constitution proposed in 2003 of the indebtedness of European culture to its Christian past. A post-Christian age is emerging, a secularism with an attitude. Those Christians whose vision of Christianity has become tightly bound to a cluster of moral philosophical understandings may, like Vattimo, fail to appreciate the depth of this change. In having committed themselves to a moral philosophical discourse about proper human behavior, which discourse has roots independent of traditional Christianity, they nevertheless associate themselves with Christianity. In great measure, they may do this because their Christianity of reference is that Christianity which came into existence through affirming a robust faith in reason. As a consequence, they do not affirm a moral discourse focused on obligations to God. Remember, if you look at both the Old and New Testament, nowhere does anyone talk about human rights. No one gets any human rights. You simply have a God who commands and you get new duties. I give you a new commandment. Each other. Indeed, philosophy may falsely appear to be enough to establish how one should act. Such claims regarding the capacities of thought lie at the foundations of Western morality from the scholasticism of the 13th century to the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant, the arguments of some Franciscans to the contrary notwithstanding. I'm appreciative of the Franciscans who were highly critical of Thomas Aquinas and constituted what the via moderna over against the via antiqua. This faith in moral philosophy led to the emergence of a moral philosophy that now aspires to create a list of human rights in lieu of the obligations established by God who commands. The prominence of the discourse of human rights, human dignity, and social justice, and its substitution for a discourse of obligations to God, is a mark of the post-Christian age and the triumph of secular culture. The mark of traditional Christian moral understanding is a discourse of obligation to God, including commands regarding one's neighbor, not a discourse of human rights, dignity, and social justice. In contrast, the contemporary secular discourse is correct in seeing itself as having an integrity in the order of being, such that it need not acknowledge its connection to Christianity in the order of history. For this secular culture indeed constitutes a novum, a moral vision separated from and even at odds with contemporary Christianity. In this presentation, as I said, I will explore this secularism that has come to define the dominant culture of Western Europe and the Americas. The next section argues that one can best understand the dramatic rupture of the Christian culture of Europe and the Americas from Christianity in terms of 5 intertwined forces that have led us into our contemporary post-Christian secular culture. The first is the collapse of Christendom, of polities committed to maintaining Christian discourse as the norm for the public forum and the public space. 2. Disarray of the mainline Christian churches, which in the case of Protestantism began in the late 18th and early 19th century and became marked by the mid-20th century, and in the case of Roman Catholicism achieved salience after Vatican II, all of which has become tied to an ecumenism that undermined the appreciation of theological truth and further debilitated the mainline Christian denomination. 3. The collapse of metaphysics, so that morality and culture can no longer be recognized as rooted in reality. That was my metaphor of all these intuitions supported by different narratives floating in the free space within the horizon of the finite and the immanent. You can note that, again, the collapse of metaphysics, so that morality and culture can no longer be recognized as rooted in reality, in being in itself, so that there is now, 4th, the emergence instead of the now dominant secular culture articulated fully within the horizon of the finite and limited, a culture framed as if God did not exist, along with 5, secular fundamentalist states committed to removing Christian discourse from the public forum and public space. Now, I introduced the notion of secular fundamentalist states. If one is in Iran and wishes in the Iranian parliament to speak about the truth of Christianity, one will be politely reminded that the discourse of the public forum is Mohammedan and surely not Christian. If in the public forum of the United States one mentioned that, answered the question in Matthew, who do you think Christ is? And you said, hey, he's the Messiah of Israel, the Son of the living God, you would have been receive an analogous disapprobation as what happened in Tehran. What has happened is a fundamentalist secular state has emerged within which the public discourse about Christianity and public enforcement of Christian norms is now as forbidden as Christian discourse in Tehran. That's the secular fundamentalist state. We'll now turn to giving some sense of how these 5 factors intertwine. Although the immediate roots of our contemporary secularity reach back into the late 17th century, beginnings of the Enlightenment, the defining secularity of our times took shape in the late 20th century. Contemporary secularity is the product of the confluence of the 5 forces I just mentioned. Powerful major cultural developments. First, there are the consequences of the fall of Christendom. Christendom itself had been established by St. Constantine the Great, equal to the apostles. After his victories at the Milvian Bridge on the 28th of October 312, and at the Battle of Chrysopolis on the 18th of September 324. This Christendom, which represents not just the triumph of New Rome over the paganism of Old Rome, but the triumph of Jerusalem over Athens. that Christendom was shattered piecemeal, among other events, the fall of New Rome on that terrible Tuesday, May 29th, 1453, and the October Revolution in Russia, the 26th of October, 1918, the fall of the Third Rome. The ruins of Christendom began then to be cleared away aggressively when the Americas, as well as European states, passed from being polities with an established Christianity to being polities whose culture was officially secular. As this collapse of Christendom took place, it became ever less plausible that the state should forbid abortion, homosexual acts, and or euthanasia. You can see the puzzles when people talk about monogamous marriage. Realize the only group that had monogamous marriage as a real requirement are Christians. I recommend that you who are of a more Berlusconi inclination read Moses Maimonides' reflections on the Mishnah Torah as to how many women at the same time a pious Jew might have, and who might, amongst the women a pious Jew might have, he could have not just wives but concubines, which as you've read the Bible, patriarchs, because Abraham had concubines, not just wives, and kings. That explain Berlusconi's some problems of drawing certain lines. A further collapse of what has been a contentful morality grounded in Christian ethics can be anticipated if everyone recalls much of our law presupposes ideas of human deportment only explicable in terms of Christian commitments. These developments were connected with a second decisive event, mid-century collapse of mainline Christianity. And the people who say, oh, Christianity didn't collapse, Professor Hogan was nice enough to point out that I assume my present professorial appointment before many of the people in the room were ever born. When I first went to Europe in 1954, which is probably before your parents were born, Roman Catholic churches throughout Europe full, and Protestant churches actually had live people in it. I've watched its death. Something remarkable and widespread took place only within my lifetime, which is now only 70 years. Vatican II, along with analogous transformations of the dominant Protestant churches of the West, broke many connections that had still bound Western Christianity to traditional Christian pieties. Mainline Protestantism in the 19th century was already in deep decline in England and Central Europe. In the mid-20th century, there was a further loss of faith and an abandonment of commitment to the unique faith of any particular confession, indeed religion. An ecumenism grounded in a loss of sectarian commitment emerged, which radically changed what it meant to be a member of a mainline Christian body. It was not just Roman Catholics began to have steak on Friday and hard-shell Methodists to drink beer and hard liquor. More significantly, they no longer saw their religious commitments as uniquely constituting the correct understanding of the pursuit of the kingdom of heaven. This state of affairs was summed up by a cartoon which one of my daughters gave to me, of an old theology professor speaking to a young and intense seminarian. In the cartoon, the professor tells the seminarian, I know those were the dogmas that established and once defined our denomination, but no one believes them anymore. A passionate ecumenism has erased a clear recognition of what many people nevertheless appreciate in their heart. Should God exist, his demands are beyond negotiation or compromise. The last truth is apprehended in a recognition, if God exists, one would be called to be a fundamentalist in the sense of acknowledging that the commands of God will always trump secular moral rationality and the demands of the secular state. The clearing away of the ruins of Christendom, the collapse of the mainline churches are tied to a third development, the collapse of the metaphysical foundations for the dominant traditional morality and culture of Western Europe. The credibility of the Western argument supporting its natural law argument, which emerged in the 13th century, born of a synthesis of Aristotelian Stoicism and Christianity, abruptly lost credibility. This collapse of faith in metaphysics and natural law has led, among other things, to the emergence of a powerful public homosexual movement demanding the recognition not just of the moral aseity of homosexual acts, but even of homosexual marriages on a par with traditional heterosexual marriages. Concubinage has become openly accepted, and fornication no longer occasions embarrassment. Again, I'm an old man. I've been flying on planes since the 70s. When I was flying on planes in the 70s, no one in plane turned and said, "My daughter Buffy has just moved with her boyfriend, J.R." If anyone mentioned it, they would have blushed. Now, around me, they say, "Oh, my daughter Buffy, she had moved in with her boyfriend, J.R., but she's now left and she shacked up with Bubba." It's a brand new culture. Roman Catholic nuns have begun to dream of being priestesses. Traditional Christian morality and metaphysics have evanesced. At the same time, dialectical materialism has collapsed as well. Analogy, the Soviet Union, having lost belief in its moral and metaphysical commitments, passed away overnight. Its dialectical, materialist, metaphysical commitments were generally abandoned. Russia reemerged from the Soviet Union with Orthodox Christianity defining its public space, if not indeed its public forum. The People's Republic of China, for its part, became an exemplar Confucian free market state. The people's means of production was sold on the Shanghai Stock Exchange in Western Europe and the Americas. This has meant a general abandonment of natural law and metaphysical morality, a morality anchored in being, all of which had been taken for granted since the Western Christian Middle Ages. All of this has also been tied to a fourth phenomenon, the collapse not simply of traditional Western Christian morality and its natural law foundations, but the salience of a publicly established morality without foundations. If all is approached as if everything came from nowhere, went to nowhere, for no ultimate purpose, then, as Protagoras quite rightly knew, men become the measure and standard of all things. This change in the appreciation of reality effected a radical deflation of the content of traditional morality. Among other things, choices regarding one's engagement in sexuality, reproduction, self-killing have become mere lifestyle or deathstyle choices. They have lost their moral significance. The decision whether or not to fornicate or engage in homosexual actions has become a non-moral choice. The choice of whether to define one's life as a heterosexual, as a homosexual, or as a shoe fetishist has become a lifestyle choice, not a moral choice. The choice as to whether or not to use physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia has become a death-style choice. It was initially hoped that this deflated morality, this post-Christian morality after metaphysics and after foundations, would at least be able to affirm the canonicity of the cardinal slogans of the French Revolution. Many attempted to establish them as canonical moral commitments, namely the slogans of liberty, equality, human dignity, and social justice. In particular, one sought to be free and equal without moral reproof, to make one's own lifestyle and deathstyle choices, as long as, within the constraints of social justice, one affirmed others as free, equal, and possessing human dignity. What sense, though, can one make of the assertion, all men are created equal, once one is in a culture after God and after metaphysics? If God is not recognized as creating all men in some sense equal, in what way are humans equal? What would be the canonical force of claims of human equality? As a result, at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, Rorty, Richard Rorty, and others came to admit that one faces an unavoidable recasting, at least the force of secular morality. Rorty quite correctly understood, now I'm quoting from Richard Rorty, we can keep the notion of morality just as long as we can cease to think of morality as the voice of the divine part of ourselves, and instead give it as the voice of ourselves as members of a community, speakers of a common language. We can keep the morality prudence distinction if we think of it as the difference between an appeal to the unconditioned and an appeal to the conditioned, but not in that fashion, but as the difference between an appeal to the interests of our community and the appeal to our own interests, possibly conflicting private interests. The importance of this shift is that it makes it impossible to ask the question, are society moral? I repeat, the importance of this shift makes it impossible to ask the question, is our society moral? There's no standpoint. The difficulty with secular morality is that, parce rority, without begging the question, arguing in a circle, engaging in infinite regress, one cannot establish the moral priority of even a community of anonymous persons, the so-called moral review, over the claims of a particular community of those for which one is most concerned and socially historically bound. The community of one's family, friends, and close associates. Without foundations and in the absence of a God's perspective, neither the autonomous community of all persons nor the community to whom one is bound in love and ultimate loyalty can be shown conclusively to have a compelling rational priority. Rorty's attempt to save something of morality to traditional priority over prudence fails. One is left with a plurality of moralities and normative fabrics, some even rejecting the moral point of view, sustained in different moral discourses supported by different socially, historically conditioned narratives. As Immanuel Kant appreciates some centuries before Rorty, morality cannot sustain its traditional claims of a canonical singularity and priority over the demands of prudence unless one acts as if God existed and as if there were immortality. To wake you up, I'm going to try to remind you, because I'm sure every morning you get up and you read the second critique through and Kant's Grundlegung zur Metaphysics des Sitten, and you know that when Kant enters into the dialectic of the second critique, the Critique of Practical Reason, published in 1788, he points out that the only way that one could think of morality as being rational, not an incentive, not to make you be moral, no, you'll be barbecued if you don't, but the idea that you could get morality to be rational is to act as if God existed and as if there were mortality. The as-if language isn't used to be strict. If we were teaching Kant seminar, he tells you that has to be a postulate of your actions. The as-if language about God is only used in the appendix of the dialectic of the first week, where Kant turns out to be a intelligent design freak. You've got to imagine everything is designed by God as if there were. So as-if language works there. But he realized without a God's eye perspective, the whole project would collapse. He realizes if you don't do that, you're in the arms of Hegel. That scares you, right? The fifth force driving the rupture of the contemporary culture from traditional Christianity and from the culture of Christendom is the emergence of a secular fundamental state. By a secular fundamentalist polity, I mean a polity that frames its laws, institutions, and professions in conformity with a particular secular philosophical understanding of appropriate conduct, including a particular secular understanding of morality, to which, to some extent, the state requires all institutions, professions, citizens, and even residents to conform. Such a state supports through state funds its particular secular ideological moral understanding, along with its secular morality and its institutions, while refusing to support those who deviate from the secular norm. The secular fundamentalist states requires professions, professionals, and institutions in the public space in their department to conform in various extents to the dictates of the established secular philosophical orthodoxy. Civil society in a secular fundamentalist state is shaped and constrained by the fundamentalist secular state's established ideology. That secular ideology, being established by the state, defines and marginalizes the role of religious discourse, religious institutions, for example, churches, and religiously affiliated institutions, religiously affiliated hospitals, for example, while advancing its particular secular and moral commitments. Through the imposition of the ideology of the secular fundamentalist state, religious concerns are relegated to a circumscribed, ever-shrinking sphere of privacy. These post-traditional Christians who have embraced the discourse of human rights, human equality, human dignity, and social justice may not fully recognize how dramatic this change is. In summary, the 5 points: the fall of Christendom and the large-scale collapse of mainline Christian churches went hand in hand with the collapse of the public salience of traditional moral visions grounded in metaphysics and natural law, as well as the emergence of a secular morality and culture ever more recognized to be without foundations in conclusive rational argument and without an anchor in anything on a cluster of moral intuitions sustained by a particular socio-historically conditioned narrative, which have now all those changes been allied with the emergence of the secular fundamentalist state. Again, such states are polities committed to expunging, not just from the public forum, but from the public space, Christian discourse in general and Christian discourse in particular, or even Christian behavior. I am an ornery Texan, and my spiritual father has to try to break my will as a Texan. As you probably know, in the authoritative histories of Texas, Texans are pointed out as having 3 virtues, 1 being vulgar, 2 being violent, and 3 being proud of the first 2 virtues. As a result, when I was baptized, I was given the name of a very humble Orthodox saint from Alaska, Herman of Alaska. But if one looks now at this point and tries to see what it is to live in this public space, it gives a certain joy to the obligations one has in general to just be a Christian. I fly a lot. I've flown every weekend since the 1st of September. This is the 22nd lecture given. I've so far gone about 120,000 miles, and I'm still to go to Hong Kong and Alaska and China. But when the plane takes off, I always cross myself. The people around me begin looking at the engine. They get scared. They don't know that all Christians cross themselves when they begin a journey. And of course, I cross myself when it lands. And again, they wonder, wow, is the engine about to fall off? Traditional Christianity is to be quarantined in ever decreasing private space. Such secular fundamentalist states wish to marginalize, if not extirpate, Christianity. However, traditional Christianity understands that Jesus is the Messiah of Israel, the Son of the living God, and that Christ has established a unique, visible church, which visible church is the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. This Christianity, which is fundamentalist in its commitments, in that it understands that the God who commands trumps the demands of the secular state, also understands that one should act in ways that contrast radically with the secular morality that now dominates and that is now without foundations. Again, the result is that the secular and its morality float in a cloud of intuitions within the bounds of the secular and the finite, all without an anchor in a non-social historically conditioned reality. Okay, this is all bad news. The question is, what do we do now? Now, the first thing I do is not read to you the next two sections, which are just fantastic sections, but I won't read to you. And I'll go to the last section, which has the title, Converting the World, Taking Christianity Seriously. So, up to now, you've seen a part of my diagnosis. The diagnosis that I'm not forced you to listen to is a detailed examination of Kant and then a detailed examination of Hegel and how that brings us right up to where we find ourselves now. That is written but not to be read. Now I'm going to talk about what we should do. I'll have some more coffee. I've read this enough so I go to sleep listening to myself. How then should a traditional Christian respond in the face of this new secular age? Alistair McIntyre, at the end of After Virtue, first published in 1981, acknowledged the uniqueness of the challenges. As he put it, and I quote, "This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing us for some time. And it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We are waiting for a Godot. Not waiting for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different Saint Benedict." To make sense of McIntyre's observation, one would need to understand more clearly the importance of Saint Benedict and the establishment of the West in 529 of the monastic movement came to be named for Saint Benedict, which movement reflected the great inspirations of Saint Pachomius of Egypt. Benedict's primary contribution was not to preserve Christian culture during the Middle Ages, a task fully successfully shouldered by Constantinople, rather to assemble a brotherhood who, through prayer, would convert still largely pagan Western Europe. Consider how the life of Pachomius, Saint Pachomius, begins. I quote, The Word of God who made all things came to our father Abraham and ordered him to sacrifice his only son. He said to him, I will shower blessings on you. I will make your descendants as many as the stars of the heaven. All the nations of the earth shall be blessed in your seed. After our father Abraham spoke, he spoke then to Moses, his prophet and servant, and to all the prophets. Then he appeared and spoke as a man, as the seed of Abraham, for he had promised to him a blessing for the nations. And he commanded his disciples, go and teach all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Christian monasticism is first and foremost about seeking the God of the Christians. It is about obedience to the Holy Trinity. It's about how God's grace and rightly ordered prayer to convert all to the one true visible church. In the second and third lines of the prologue to his rule, St. Benedict says, the law of obedience will bring you back to him from whom you have drifted to the sloth of disobedience. The message of mine is for you then, if you are ready to give up your own will once and for all, and armed with strong and noble weapons of obedience, to battle for the true King, Christ the Lord. It's a picture of the Benedictines in the 6th century as culture warriors. It's a picture of the Benedictines as culture warriors who understood their greatest weapons were prayer and love, not culture, not the preservation of culture. Everything in these passages is to be focused on Christ through a life of obedience and prayer. In any usual sense of the term fundamentalist, true monks are true fundamentalists. It is their fundamental commitment to prayer that has always and still does change the world and sanctify the world. You notice I'm trying to connect the obscure and maybe misleading remark of Alistair MacIntyre to why the Benedictines were, in the 6th and the 7th century, so important. Think of how different this traditional Benedictine image is from what is suggested by the contemporary post-Christian culture, and especially its secularized, transformed image of Christianity. For example, a contemporary European intellectual, in his reflections on the current spiritual and cultural crisis of Europe, argues that in order to confront the contemporary secularity and ultimate rootlessness, one should establish a non-denominational civil religion in Europe. I quote, "What I'm suggesting is therefore a non-denominational Christian religion. As I envisage, this religion would have more monasteries than central churches, more monks that articulate and communicate than church officials, more practitioners than preachers." This suggested therapy is exactly wrong. It fails to make the right diagnosis and therefore offers the wrong treatment. It fails to recognize why Christianity in Europe is in disarray. The difficulties lie not in philosophers failing through philosophical argument aggressively to reconnect morality to being, or because Western Europe lacks a Christian civil religion. The difficulty is that Europe's culture has lost the rightly directed asceticism, almsgiving, and prayer, which the Benedictines understood, that can loan, sustain, and restore and create an authentic Christianity. In 1921, a young man changed the world. With only 2 years of primary education, he became the greatest theologian of the 20th century. Elder Joseph the Hesychast, born in 1898 and who reposed in 1959, left the world for the Holy Mountain, for Mount Athos, Agios Oros. After the October Revolution and the enslavement of most Eastern Europe to Soviet communism, along with the consequences of the civil war in Greece, Mount Athos seemed headed towards an unavoidable decline, if not death. Its monasteries were becoming ever more depopulated, leaving mostly aged monastics often living in half ruins. Elder Joseph changed everything. He changed it all by prayer. He changed it by becoming holy. Others came to join him, such as the great theologian now residing in America, the Elder Ephraim. Notice that's what the Benedictines did in the 6th century. To appreciate the extraordinary character of those who were true theologians, the true culture, and the consequences of their prayer in the face of a secular culture, one might recall that in 1947, no one less, now listen, no one less than John the Baptist announced to the small group of ascetics gathered around Elder Joseph the Hesychast that a man by the name of John, who would later become Elder Ephraim, was coming to join them. As Elder Ephraim notes in his recollections, in 1947 he came to the dock of St. Anne's on the Holy Mountain, and an old monk, Monk Arsenius, greeted him. The monk said, "Aren't you Johnny from Volos?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "How do you know me?" Then Arsenius answers, "Oh," he said, "the Honorable Forerunner appeared to Elder Joseph last night and said to him, 'I'm bringing you a little lamb, put him in your sheepfold.'" The prayers of the holy monks around Elder Joseph the Hesychast gathered other people to him who would not simply be good or virtuous, but something radically beyond the good and the virtuous, namely the holy. Elder Joseph and those around him prayed, and others came. Now monasteries on Mount Athos are filling with young monastics, and they are changing the world. They are doing what the Benedictines did in the 6th and 7th century. What does this suggest one should do to face the secularization that confronts us? The answer is, one should pray, one should give alms, one should keep the traditional fast, One of my best friends, who has a PhD in philosophy and a PhD in classics, is now in a monastery outside of San Antonio, Holy Archangels. He is not there to copy manuscripts, maintain a cultural tradition, or become a better philosopher in any secular sense of a philosopher. He is there to be a philosopher in a radically different sense from that which the world expects. He is there to be a lover of the holy wisdom of God, the Agio Sophia, Christ himself. It is holiness that changes the world. Only holiness can counteract the world's secularization. It is the theocentric horn of Euthyphro's dilemma that sustains culture. It points to holiness, the persons of the Trinity, who invite us through the true cult of right worship and right belief to encounter the Messiah of Israel, the Son of the living God. They invite us to holiness. And that holiness is beyond the good, beyond the right, and beyond the virtuous. It sets the secular aside. The recognition of the possibility of holiness invites us to God and will change our culture. Thank you very much.